Good evening. My name is Jennifer Rabb. I'm the director of the McNair Center for Entrepreneurship and Economic Growth here at the Baker Institute. And welcome. Thank you for coming for our program on the implications of Brexit for U.S. private enterprise. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the director of the Baker Institute, Ambassador Edward Dirigian, who's here. He's my boss. Big round of applause, please, for my boss. Our program tonight is first a keynote address, as you will see in your program, followed by a panel discussion. The panel will discuss economic implications, particularly for the U.S. and for Texas. Toward the end of the panel discussion, we'll have a question and answer session. And you are welcome to ask your questions at that time. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, James Tumbridge, who hails from London, England. He is an attorney specializing in regulatory and technology matters. In his law practice, he has the honor and privilege of counting among his clients the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the Cabinet Office. His remarks tonight, I want to be clear, are not on behalf of the government, but instead his own impressions based on his experience in working with the government. James.
Well, thank you all very, very much for coming along to hear this Brit come. Oh, I'm losing my piece of paper. There's not much on it, but I don't want to lose it. And thank you very much for the opening remarks. Very, very kind. And yes, as you've heard, I supposedly know a little bit about Brexit. I sort of start with my embarrassing admission, but actually perhaps here in this room it's not so embarrassing that I'm James and I like politics. But in my day job, I'm a lawyer, and I have, as you've heard, for some time as a lawyer, provided some legal advice to the political side of the Cabinet Office, which is the Department of State in which the Prime Minister resides. And through that, I have some appreciation for some of the things that they're concerned about. But the thing I just have to stress is very much my observations from that political experience and my legal advice. And I don't work for the UK government at all. That said, hopefully one or two things I will say will be of interest to you. I've got quite a lot I'm meant to cover. I thought one of the things I wanted to start with, because the vast majority of my clients as a professional practice lawyer are actually North American. And anyone who pays attention to international news will invariably find that they only get perhaps 10-20% of the domestic news coverage reported to them overseas. One of the biggest concerns I have about Brexit is that because 60% of the domestic news coverage is deeply negative about Brexit, you might think that we've all taken leave of our senses. And you might still think that at the end of this talk, and my colleagues might think that regardless. But I did want to explain to you, as far as I can, some of the motivations that you may not have heard about as to why the United Kingdom wanted to have Brexit. And they are very different. One of the first things that's not always easy to understand is that in domestic British politics since 1987, right the way through to the present day, it has not been good, if you want to get elected domestically, to say anything positive about the European Union. And as a result, we haven't had a Prime Minister since 1987, when Margaret Thatcher was still in office, that actually said that what is now the European Union is a good thing. You would actually find, generation after generation, Tony Blair chief amongst them, telling us all that he'd gone off to the latest round of negotiations, and he'd come back from the Lisbon Treaty in 2006. And I'm terribly sorry, British public, but I couldn't quite get all you wanted, but I really fought for you. And one of the things that the political class hadn't really stopped to think about is that we had been subliminally messaging for a very long time that there are a lot of issues with the European Union, and there hadn't been anybody saying about what's positive about it, and there are positive things. In addition, the European Union has really moved on from the time in which the United Kingdom joined it. When we joined in the 1970s, we were known as the sick man of Europe. Our economy was in a very bad place. The European community was a very positive and growing economic hub, and we wanted in. And initially, you may know that the French told us no twice, quite firmly. And then de Gaulle went, and we were allowed in eventually. And overnight, our economic arrangements changed. You know, as a trading nation, as an island nation, we've always looked to the globe for trade. And there were some people that weren't very happy because overnight we were suddenly not so kind to Australia and New Zealand and Canada, countries with which we had close and strong bonds. But we shifted our centre of gravity. Now, when we joined in the 1970s, we were joining the economic community, and it did have its origins in the post-Second World War concerns to find ways for Europe to work together in harmony. It started with sharing a treaty on steel to avoid armaments, but it has grown a great deal. And since 1992, it's been the European Union, and it's had a political agenda, one that often politicians aren't particularly open about, to create a federal state of Europe, where the United Kingdom would perhaps be like Texas or California or New York is to the USA. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate aim, but people aren't very honest about it, and the domestic population probably aren't ready for it, which is what the referendum vote in part shows. And the two final points I wanted to make about why did we look at Brexit in the way that we did was that, very simplistically, in the 1990s, the European Union decided that it was to be illegal to use imperial measurements. And the UK found that something of a shock. You had people coming into convenience stores and they wanted to order a pound of butter, and they weren't allowed to order a pound of butter. And whilst one could understand that at an international level that the EU thought this was good, it was one of those things that for some people was an unnecessary interference in their everyday lives. It really didn't make a lot of difference domestically in the economy. And so why did they do it? And you had instances like that that were being cited and referred to by people that actually didn't do any business outside the United Kingdom, didn't enjoy the kind of organisational activity that I do, where I'm an intellectual property lawyer, I'm a pan-European lawyer, my firm has offices in Germany and the UK, and we work in a very harmonious way, and so we see the advantages. But you had instances like that where the public didn't. And you also had a big shift. In the 1970s, because of the challenges to the UK economy, you had practically no businesses which said that entering what was then the EC was a bad idea. But this time round, we had some businesses that might surprise you, and I'll ask my colleagues not yet to jump in and point out precisely all the reasons why, because some of them are interesting. But one that we were talking about is Dyson, the vacuum manufacturer and so on. Dyson, James Dyson, is not a fan of the European Union. He's not a fan about how they regulate. Now, there are different reasons for that, but that was quite interesting. That was quite a moment to have such a prominent businessman and inventor saying that he didn't like the EU. Aston Martin also said that they weren't happy with the EU. JCB, which is a heavy vehicle manufacturer, again, very much led by the chairman of that organisation and his views of Europe, but that's a large manufacturer that exports a great deal that didn't like the European Union. And also Tate & Lyle Sugar, which is a major importer of sugarcane, didn't like the importation tariffs. So they're just a little smattering of businesses that felt that the way the EU operated and the way the EU regulated wasn't necessarily perfect for them. There were many other businesses that disagreed, particularly tertiary financial insurance services. They're very concerned about what we call passporting, which is the system by which, if you're an American bank and you set up in London and you get a banking license in London, you can offer your service pan-European without any other regulatory concerns. So we had this mixture, but I thought it was just important to set that scene that not every aspect of the EU was seen as positive, and give you some little flavours as to perhaps why, but also to recognise that as a result, the news media would almost only ever talk as if it was about some negative concern about some very little Englander perspective. But there are some of these businesses that say that their concern is about talent, that because of domestic concerns we have over migration, that we have no control over our European borders, we have been very unkind, some would say, to Canadians and Americans and Australians and people from New Zealand. It was much harder for them to get visas. And that's one of the things that could be quite positive in a post-Brexit world, because the UK government has confirmed that we will have a single approach to visas. It will not matter where you are from. If you meet our scientific requirement to come in under the scientific visa, if you meet the financial investment requirement to come under that, we will no longer care where you're coming from. It will be more of a level playing field. And for the North American clients that I deal with, that's often considered to be quite welcome, because I have countless experiences in my time of North American businesses that have been good enough to choose the United Kingdom as to where they set up. They start employing people, they want to send over somebody to observe their investment, and they can't get a visa. Economic growth has also shifted. The economic growth around the world, there's a great deal more activity going on in Asia and actually in Latin America, and at the current time the United Kingdom is not permitted to agree independent trade deals outside of the EU. And so that backdrop is to simply say to you that what was at the heart of all this was sovereignty, something that I suspect this audience, being in the US, might have a greater understanding of, because the origin of this country, the origin indeed of how Texas joined the Union, you often as a nation continue to embrace the importance of your devolved elements and the accountability of your government, and I think that it's often too simplistic. I'm afraid I still have NAFTA in my head. I believe now your trade agreement is the US, Canada, Mexico, and I'm not sure what the acronym is, so I won't try and get it right. But if I was to say to you that the EU is not that, I'm often encountering American businessmen that seem to be shocked. They think it's exactly the same thing, and it's not, because we have a European Parliament that can pass laws which have direct effect that our domestic legislature has no say over. We have a pan-European court which is aimed at harmonising, and there's a good side to that, but it's also led to some very concerning decisions in some parts of Europe. And we have ceded an element of our sovereignty over trade policy, and there is an ambition in some quarters of the European Union. They created a foreign representative. They want an independent foreign policy for Europe. They want a European army, which the various countries of Europe should contribute to. And it's a perfectly legitimate aim that those can be very good things, and you can see them as very good things, but it wasn't necessarily uniformly the view of the whole of Europe, and it certainly, as it turns out, wasn't the uniform view of the United Kingdom. So what are we trying to do now? Well, actually, the main thing is to embrace the opportunity, because I like to focus on the fact that we are changing our relationships with Europe. It's not about turning our backs on Europe. We remain European, so I'm still 20 miles from France, despite what some of my German competitors might tell you, that somehow we've sunk beneath the waves of the Atlantic. We're still there. And we don't want to stop doing business. And in fact, this is unscientific, but I genuinely believe that if you were to hold a referendum and we had a form of membership that was purely trade-focused, I think you'd have 70 to 80% of the United Kingdom population entirely comfortable with that. It was the sovereignty dichotomy. There were people across the UK that didn't feel that globalisation and the harmonisation was working for them. So, as I mentioned, the United Kingdom is not entitled to have trade deals on an independent basis. But we've been quite inventive in doing other things. Indeed, Texas was one of the recipients of this, in that we have a biomedical bridge, which was announced last year. This is not a trade deal, but it is a very encouraging arrangement whereby we try and work on some regulatory alignment, and there's some appropriate tax incentives and so on for medical research between Texas-based universities and research institutes and British-based hospitals and research institutes. We have a fintech bridge to Australia. We have a fintech bridge to Canada. None of these things are trade deals, you understand. Equally, we have been conducting trade audits, because it's very, very important that we understand who we do business with. And we have, in our first year after Brexit, we conducted 24 trade audits. These are not trade deals in any way. But the hope and intention of the former Trade Secretary, which I used to work with, was that at midnight on whatever day we do eventually change our relationship with Europe, that these things would roll on. And in fact, it's now become much more public and stated, and there's a greater level of comfort with the EU. So the United Kingdom has now entered into 44 trade deals in principle. This covers 70 different countries around the world. In the European arena, it includes countries like Switzerland and Norway. With Switzerland, that's worth 32 billion a year to the United Kingdom economy. In Asia, we have a trade agreement agreed with South Korea. It's the same agreement as with the EU. It will immediately roll over upon departure. We have an agreement with the Andean community of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, which is estimated to be worth 2.1 billion. Well, there are some countries we can't do business with on that, even on that basis. Turkey, for example, which is not a part of the EU, but it is part of the customs union. And that I will come on to in a moment, because I hope to try and illustrate why Northern Ireland is a challenge for us. But overall, the 70 countries with whom we have these agreements in principle, they domestically have £5.6 trillion in GDP, and it is hoped, therefore, that the UK will be able to go in a new direction, a positive new direction. The other aspect to our changing relationship, though, is with regard to Ireland. And this has proved very problematic. And indeed, I was mildly concerned that I would be coming in here this evening with some new announcement from London and everything I planned to say had suddenly shifted. But happily, they hadn't done a deal tonight, so my intelligence is not wrong, not yet. One of the things that I did today, I'm boring enough to admit this, is I actually went and read the 35 pages of the Good Friday Agreement, otherwise known as the Belfast Agreement, which is the agreement that happily ended sectarian violence in Northern Ireland. There is not a single mention of the Northern Irish border in those 35 pages, which might surprise you if you've heard the news that apparently our big problem is sectarian violence on the Northern Irish border. It isn't. I mean, it's a very convenient whipping item in the news media. There is a genuine problem that for the Republic of Ireland, they are the only ones with a land border with us, and there is a great deal of movement of goods and cattle and other items across that border. But 85% of Northern Irish businesses actually exclusively trade within the UK, and most of the goods that move are foodstuffs and agricultural products. And what the UK Prime Minister offered the EU a few weeks ago in his New Deal was an acceptance that we would agree to maintain regulatory alignment for at least 4 years in all foodstuffs, in all manufactured products, and that would allow these things to move seamlessly across the border in Northern Ireland without any regulatory safety checks. Alongside that, there would be a system which we operate already in Europe, whereby if you are an exporter, you can, through a government portal, state what your export consignment will be to wherever it's going, and it's largely checked on an electronic basis, and then there are periodic spot checks at your factory to keep you honest, to make sure that you're not saying that you're sending out 10,000 widgets when in fact it was 15,000. This is the heart, simplistically the heart of the new offer to deal with the Northern Irish border. And it's an important one. And the other aspect to it is the devolved assembly, which we agreed to, which is a power sharing system. Unfortunately, it's currently not operating, but it's got to come back, between the Nationalists and the Republicans in Northern Ireland, and every 4 years they would have to agree as to whether that system would go on. And that's the big difference between Theresa May's offering earlier in the year and Prime Minister Johnson's, is that he's found a way to offer an element of regulatory alignment to make movement on the border easier, which the UK government doesn't object to, because it doesn't interfere with our desire to do trade deals. It's not a full customs union, which is what Turkey has, which is why we can't do a trade deal with Turkey. Turkey has to have their trade deal blessed by the European Union. And for the Conservative government, which is the Conservative and Unionist party, and by union they mean the union of the four nations, it's a very difficult issue for them to agree to Northern Ireland being treated differently to the rest of the United Kingdom. I hope that gives you some flavour of those elements. And what I wanted to sort of move on to is perhaps a little bit more of the opportunity on the bilateral arrangements with the United States. The 2017 figure I have from the UK Department of Trade is that our bilateral trade is worth £183 million a year. Earlier this year, the White House said that they thought that a bilateral agreement could more than triple our trade. I'd be delighted if that is true. But certainly there are areas of opportunity. One of the things that I want to say very loud and proud for the benefit of my colleagues and I is that we're intellectual property lawyers and Brexit doesn't change it. So we are in a system, and actually this is another point that isn't always appreciated, that the European Patent Convention is nothing to do with the European Union. In fact, it's an example of how European nations can come together and agree to share arrangements in the patenting space, which of course is quite serious because it's 20-year monopolies, without having to do it through the mechanism of the European Union. In fact, the EPC has 38 countries in it. And one of the casualties potentially of Brexit, and it's actually the big first thing I did as a government advisor, is I'm, hopefully in this room no one's going to complain, but I was responsible for convincing the UK government to bid for something called the Unitary Patent Court. This is a system to mimic what you have here, that we would have a single set of courts for patents, because at the moment what happens is you can apply for your patent, it gets granted across Europe. If you want to enforce it, you go country by country. And of course, theoretically, to go across hundreds of, well, not hundreds, but 20 to 30 countries, that's a lot of money, that's a big issue. And so the theory is one pan-European court should declare your patents valid or infringed. Previous Prime Minister was going to give it away to Germany. We persuaded them not to do that and bid for it. But the European Union didn't like that arrangement. They didn't want it to be a European Patent Convention agreement with 38 countries, which includes non-EU countries like Norway, like Switzerland, and insisted that it's only available to EU members. And as we are departing, the United Kingdom may not be able to continue. The United Kingdom's offer to Europe immediately after Brexit to actually demonstrate that our changing relationship is not because we hate Europe, we just want a different relationship, was to say this is the first example of we still want to host that court, we still want to be part of that system. Can we please go back to the original intention and open it up to all European Patent Convention states, so the EU plus a bunch of other countries. I regret at the present time Brussels doesn't agree with that. Germany does, interestingly, but that's sort of an example of how actually we've got a fluidity to the relationships, and it's not all about walking away. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, I think visas could be a very positive part of the new arrangements that could enable us to work in greater harmony with the United States. We also have some interesting things that we might be able to do in regulatory alignment. I'm not saying we will, but certainly, there's often a tension between the European Medical Agency and its approach to pharmaceutical regulation and the FDA here. Actually, a lot of the financial investment and research is often transatlantic. We can look at whether we actually, in some areas, are more closely aligned with the United States. We have been unable, at a European level, to agree to a patent term extension for pharmaceutical products. For the pharmaceutical industry, it often takes a very long time to get regulatory approval, and by the time you get regulatory approval, your patent life is nearly up, and all that money you've spent developing your drug is at risk. And so you have a patent extension, we don't have a patent extension, we have something called a supplementary protection certificate. It's a lesser right. I'm not saying we will do this, but again, one of the opportunities is to look at, is our current arrangement the best arrangement? Could we actually encourage more innovation by actually having a straightforward patent term extension? Data, please don't shoot me, I'm sort of one of the authors of the GDPR. Actually, in truth, I'm not really an author of the GDPR, I'm an author of the UK variant of it. And I wrote all the exemptions, all the bits that make it possible for you to do the things that you want to do. But nonetheless, one of the big problems we have is the tension between Europe and the United States on personal data, and what is considered to be safe, what is considered to be secure, what access to law enforcement agencies have. In Europe, they have to go through considerably more hurdles. They have to go through more court-based checks. And Europe has a tension with the United States. It's why the Safe Harbour Agreement collapsed. It's why, quite frankly, the Privacy Shield is hanging by a thread. But if the United Kingdom can come to an agreement with the United States that works, and we know that our current law is acceptable to the European Union, there's an opportunity there for tech companies and data flows to move on a transatlantic basis by using the United Kingdom as your conduit to the continent. So I hope that has given you something of a flavour for why Brexit is not simplistically a crazy, disastrous decision for business. It is a problem. It's certainly a problem for certain financial and tertiary services. I represent and work with that space because I hold elected office on behalf of the City of London, and we are very concerned about how London needs to adjust and to ensure that financial services and tertiary services, insurance, legal services and so on are still available on a pan-European basis for those of you that want to use the United Kingdom. But there are other areas of opportunity. There are other areas where we hope we can work more closely with your great nation and the companies that emanate from here and make you very, very welcome indeed. We need the money. Do come and invest. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, James. I'm going to invite our panelists to come to the table, so give us a moment for that. We're going to start by asking our, first I'm going to start with some, a few, sort of the context of this. James has spoken about political and diplomatic and legal matters. We are going to talk strictly about economic matters and business matters now. We're not going to talk about the wisdom of Brexit or the current status of Brexit negotiations to the extent anybody actually knows what that is. Although we will touch on it incidentally. I also think that the panelists will talk about differences between a hard Brexit and a soft Brexit, as it's relevant to their comments. So I just wanted to give sort of that outline. We're going to try to stick to the numbers, basically, in this evening's discussion. So I'm going to invite the panelists to introduce themselves. And Michael, let's start on that end, and we'll just move down the table.
All right, sure. Thank you, Jennifer. Can you guys hear me? All right, perfect. Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Trager, and I'm with the Texas Governor's Office. We have a fairly unique role in the office. Economic Development Office, period, has a very unique role where we walk the thin line between the private and public sector, working very closely with businesses, yet staying within the confines of the public sector. So I lead a very diverse team that can be summarized in 3 different groups: business development, which is the project management stuff that you see perhaps in the headlines. We'll recruit businesses to come and do business in Texas, as well as marketing and community relations. The other group deals with economic development finance, so as we lovingly call them, the bank. It's a collection of incentives, tax abatements, trust funds that we use to attract businesses to Texas. And finally, our business assistance team that, among many other things, including small business assistance, entrepreneurial support, industry engagement, includes international business and trade. And by background, I come from that space. So thank you so much for having me.
Hi, my name is Leah Mayo. I am the Executive Director of the British American Business Council of Texas. We are a transatlantic membership organization that's focused on thought leadership, mentorship, business development, and networking to support U.S. and UK companies. I've been in this role for about 18 months now, and prior to that, I spent 10 years at the UK's Department for International Trade, where I was the head of trade and investment, overseeing a team of business development experts to further support U.S. and UK companies that want to expand to either country. So I have a background in international expansion growth and have worked specifically with companies on the ground in both locations. And I was really glad that you mentioned BioBridge, because that was one of our really major projects that we're very proud of. And so it's still going and doing very well.
Hi everyone, my name's Katie Casabella. I work for Bank of America in their Chief Investment Office. In that role, I support private wealth management clients and focus on economic and investment trends, looking at the European Union, but as well as emerging markets, and also I'm focused on international economics, trade and investment. I like Jennifer's idea to keep this very economics and fact-based. I do not have a political opinion.
Hi everyone, I'm Saroz Bhatrai and I teach economics at UT Austin. My research and teaching interests are in international macroeconomics and monetary economics.
Thank you. So we're going to start with some general impressions about Brexit. And Leah, the first question is for you. So if I'm an American business, will Brexit make it harder or easier for me to sell goods in the UK?
Yeah, so I think that James touched on this and kind of in some of the statistics that he mentioned, but the political process that Brexit has gone through has been slightly detached from economic reality. So what we look at is our members and what they're reporting to us. Right now, they're looking at kind of anticipation, but as of now, things have not been as difficult as they did anticipate. No one really knows what to expect, so they're waiting and hoping and kind of crossing their fingers. When we talk about trade and investment, I think it's important for this conversation to talk about some qualifiers that unfortunately at this time we don't actually have an answer to. So I think some of them, maybe is it going to be a hard Brexit? Is it going to be a soft Brexit? That can directly impact, I think, whether it would be easier or more difficult for a company to sell. We really, when we're talking to our member companies, what their response is and the way that we think about this is in a slightly different way. So we look at it from a very company-based perspective. Is your company size and sophistication ready to actually undertake this kind of gigantic thing, which is selling into a foreign market? I've worked with small, scrappy startups to navigate international expansion. A lot of it depends on the team and their willingness to be able to do it and the decision making that they're able to do. I think it's also important for companies to look at market size. So what have you actually accomplished here in the United States? What are you anticipating to accomplish by trading into the UK and or EU? And we look at sector and regulation within those industries. And I think this is the most important thing. And this would, depending on your company, actually answer your question whether I think this will be difficult or easy. That's what makes or breaks it. So you're looking at life being very different for a software company that would want to do this as opposed to a financial services or life science company that may want to start exporting to the UK. So they may want to accomplish the same things, but because of the potential regulatory regime and how that's set up, I think you'll have a really different outcome. So unfortunately, I can't answer the question if it's going to be more difficult or more easy, but if you have, I think, meet some of those criteria, it can help assuage some of the issues that you may have and turn it into an opportunity.
James, it looks like you have something to say about that.
I can't resist adding just two quick comments. One thing that makes the negotiation between the United Kingdom and the EU utterly unique is that ordinarily when you start a trade negotiation, you actually have very different regulatory and domestic legal positions, and you're arguing to come up with one that you're both comfortable with. The United Kingdom and the EU are utterly in alignment right now. Therefore, we don't actually have any points of immediate friction. Our points are down the road issues. So in terms of the question, it really should make a jot of difference, because the way that the United States currently deals with the United Kingdom or the EU won't be immediately changing. The only circumstance in which that will be slightly different is that if you were to use the United Kingdom as your EU entry point and then re-export having done something such as final manufacture, and if the EU has an issue with our element of that process, but we're not changing any of our regulatory standards in the medium term. There will be regulatory divergence probably over a 10-year period, but in the immediate term, it's more about your port of entry issue. And I do accept there might be a question about re-exportation from the United Kingdom, but in terms of if you're a US company selling, immediately there will be no change.
Michael, do you have something to add on this question?
Sure, actually, quite a bit of an agreement here. Even one of the points of agreement that you will hear throughout this evening most likely is that you never know. It is very much an industry, company, and sometimes even a product-based question. I completely agree with James that because EU and the UK are so harmonized, and I doubt that the regulations will change, even though both countries are within their full rights to literally on day one to decide to do agricultural checks or custom checks on any goods that are coming through until, and this is of course in case of a no-deal Brexit. So we don't see any cause for alarm when it comes to both tariff and non-tariff barriers. Because we do not have, as far as the U.S. is concerned, we don't have a free trade agreement. And as everyone knows, if you are not in a free trade agreement, unless there are some side deals, if you are selling wine, spirits, perhaps bananas, that do have, or meat or airplanes, they usually go by the most favored nation, the WTO rule. So completely agree with James, there may not be changes, and agree with Leah that any changes or any difficulties, any barriers will depend on the company and their particular circumstances. One thing that I do want to perhaps mention is, in case there is a no deal Brexit, and there is a chance that the UK economy may suffer, the pound, and by the way, I should say, can you imagine the conversation we would be having if the UK was on the Euro system? A whole different one. So if the pound does suffer and devalues slightly, it will become more expensive for the UK businesses to purchase US goods, specifically, let's say, Texas goods. So in that macro sense, it might be a little more difficult for the US businesses to sell to the UK because they are just going to be able to afford a little less. And if as a result, the economy suffers, they may not be able to buy as much. And now, obviously, it works completely in reverse, with U.S. businesses will be able to buy so much more from the UK if the currency devalues somewhat.
Thank you. So Leah, what does a smaller EU single market mean for U.S. businesses?
So when we think about that, we're looking in terms of market access and working with already existing investors, specifically U.S. companies that are in the UK. So a lot of companies use the UK as obviously a springboard for access into further Europe, as James mentioned earlier, and have worked with a lot of companies that definitely do that to be able to kind of, it's an easy entry point for being able to sell into not only the UK, but the larger market and then go into Asia, Middle East, et cetera. I think some of the things that we will see impacting our business members would be some immigration issues, especially with already existing workers within the UK. The additional regulatory issues that we've kind of mentioned, specifically, I would say when it comes to potential life science outcomes and financial services outcomes. And what we've seen is it's been a really it's been a strong selling point for the UK to be able to say that you are being able to access this larger market. I think it's yet to be determined what will happen depending on hard Brexit, soft Brexit, what that means. Are you going to go to one discrete location, which would be the UK, versus another discrete location, which would be the EU? Or will they continue to work together as a single market? I think that's something that our companies are looking at when it comes to their already existing, operations in the UK, but don't quite have an answer to. So we're all just kind of waiting on that one.
So we're going to move on to talk about investment. Katie and Saroj, will Brexit make it harder or easier for a U.S. investor to invest in the UK or the EU? Katie, would you like to go first and talk about the U.S. perspective?
Thanks, Jennifer. Well, I think U.S. businesses U.S. businesses in the UK are already finding it harder based on all the uncertainty, whether it be FX uncertainty, foreign exchange, or monetary policy uncertainty, question marks on what the fiscal response is going to be like. I think the UK economy has definitely stalled, and investment into the UK, if you look at the data, has flatlined, while investment into the EU, 27 nations remaining, has kept pace of growth. So you're definitely seeing this uncertainty overhang on the economic outlook, which has an impact on the investment implications. So if you think about looking at the data, what a U.S. company sells in the UK is over $600 billion, much more than the trade, much more than it exports. So if you think about that $600 billion that a U.S. multinational sells through its foreign affiliates abroad, 70% of that is for the UK consumer, so what we call the local market, and 23% of that is for exports from the UK to other countries, big market being the EU. So I think that can make it difficult for US companies when they think about their investments. That 23%, much smaller share than the domestic 70%, but it equates to $140 billion worth of exports just from US companies in the UK to the rest of the world. And that doesn't include their exports back to the US. So that's more than a lot of countries export to all other nations. It's more than all of Portugal's exports. It's more than all of Hungary's. So I think that this is a huge implication for the US businesses abroad.
And Saroj, how about for Texas?
Yeah, so I'll just give a perspective a little bit from my field and then focus on the local aspect of Texas or Houston. Yeah, I completely agree that I think the biggest issue really hasn't been about Brexit per se, but since the referendum, more about the uncertainty. So, for instance, a lot of anecdotal evidence that it's really about this Brexit uncertainty and how it will be resolved that has really held back investment. So a lot of survey evidence shows at least like 1 in 5 overseas investors have canceled or put on hold plans on investment since the referendum. So in terms of the best estimate I know from my field, so researchers at the London School of Economics estimated a well-known, what we call a gravity model of foreign direct investment, and they found that EU membership raised FDI into UK by around 28%, and according to their estimate, Brexit will reduce FDI inflows by around 22%. So according to this well-known model, there's going to be probably some cost in terms of inward FDI. There also seems to be some survey evidence in line with this, that the number of jobs, for instance, created in FDI greenfield projects in the UK have fallen by around 20% as well. So there's probably going to be some effect on FDI just because investors are going to lose this single axis that we talked about. Now, in terms of local effects, I don't think there's going to be much effect for Texas per se. UK is the number one destination for FDI from Texas, but I think most of this effect, other than uncertainty, especially if it's more the hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit, is really going to be on the financial services. And I think the linkages between Texas and UK are not very strong in that sector. So I think probably in terms of whether it's going to be harder or easier for a Texas investor to invest in the UK, probably it's not going to have much of an effect, even if we believe these numbers from these researchers in the LSE that Brexit will reduce FDI inflows overall by around 20%.
So let's now address the reverse question. How will Brexit affect the investment of UK persons into the US or into Texas?
Sure, I'll start again. So generally speaking, Brexit should have very little to do with the ultimate competitiveness of the US in terms of foreign direct investment. Last year, the US attracted the largest amount of foreign capital, attracted more than double the second place destination, China. So I also think corporate tax reform is definitely going to have an impact on the competitiveness of the US. That said, weakness in the UK will have more, not as much of a direct effect, but more of a secondary effect on investment. So if the UK economy weakens, UK companies weaken, we see the potential for a decline in investment in the US in a worst case scenario. I think in the long term, there's a lot of uncertainty out there, especially on the likelihood of a US-UK trade deal, the nature of the EU-UK relationship. So I think that at this point it's a little bit uncertain on how the UK economy will respond. It really depends on a soft or a hard Brexit and the implications for the for the UK economy.
Thank you. Michael, your office works on attracting foreign direct investment to Texas from all over the world, but specifically, how do you think Brexit will impact FDI in Texas from the UK and the EU?
Sure. So we're often talking about the special relationship between US and UK. Texas and the UK, when it comes to FDI, truly do have a special relationship. UK is, as you rightly pointed out, is the #1 source of foreign direct investment for UK businesses. So we don't anticipate any direct, not to use economic term because I'm not an economist, so please forgive me. I completely agree with Katie that there may not be a direct effect, but a indirect effect with the weakening of the economy. The companies simply will not, this is not going to be, international expansion, especially to the US, which can be costly, will not be at top of mind for them, and they may need to use their dollars elsewhere. There might be also an induced effect that may actually be a positive for Texas, for companies in the EU or even around the world that may have had plans on investing in the UK and using UK as their gateway to the EU, either because of the uncertainty or post-Brexit, whichever variant comes, they decide that this might not be the best time for them to invest in the UK, will look at other markets. And there is no better market than the US, and in the US, there is really no better state than the state of Texas.
So James, what's your view on the implications for foreign direct investment going either direction?
Well, I mean, I think the challenge for the United Kingdom, because I can't tell you precisely what the nature of the relationship will be with the EU, is that we have been a very popular destination for Japanese and American businesses in particular that want to enter Europe via the United Kingdom. Now, some of the things that make us attractive as an entry port will not change. It's language, it's the legal system, it's time zone. We're very fortunate with a number of those things. And we are still going to have an arrangement with the EU. I just can't tell you precisely what it will be. But obviously, businesses might find, in particular manufacturing space, that they might wish to actually do final production somewhere inside the EU bloc, because they might find that advantageous, because the EU is a wonderful free trade area if you're inside it, and it's a very fortress Europe if you're outside it. But conversely, the other way around, the issue is for the United Kingdom economy at large. If the economy is worse, then there'll probably be fewer overseas investments. But actually, again, in terms of what we want to do, Brexit's meant to be the big shot in the arm to help us. The top 4 trade aspirations for the United Kingdom, number 1 is the United States. The second is actually, oddly, thank you to the United States for withdrawing from the acronym I'm going to get wrong, the Pacific Trade Agreement. It's the CPTPP, but I'll get the number of letters wrong. That group of nations have invited the United Kingdom to take the US position, which would be interesting. We do have a couple of small islands in the Pacific, but obviously we're the only one that don't have an obvious in. But we're engaging in that, and also we have a direct trade discussion with Australia and New Zealand. And that's all about trying to encourage more bilateral trade, and also making it as easy as possible for our companies to invest overseas and have the assurances that they want in those investments. So I know it's a little bit crystal ball gazing, but actually this is meant to be one of our upsides, is that we will have more freedom to have a bilateral agreement with Texas or with the US federal government to support that investment. So I hope that it will actually make investment in this direction easier, even if US companies have that debate about whether the UK or continental Europe is your favored entry point.
Thank you. So let's talk a bit about trade statistics. I'm going to go back to Katie and Saroj again. Katie's going to talk about US, UK trade figures, and Saroj will talk about Texas, UK trade figures. So Katie, why don't you
Okay.
start
Yeah,
off
everyone loves to talk about trade. Easy to understand, exports minus imports, right? Trade deficits are bad. So on. Anyway, here are the basic statistics. From the U.S. side, I know different governments report different things, but the U.K. is the 7th most important trading partner in terms of goods with the U.S., but the number 1 most important trading partner in terms of services. About $127 billion of goods, that's trading goods, exports plus imports, and then roughly $130 billion in services dollars. Key being financial services, transportation equipment, chemicals, machinery. However, I like to think about the most important way that U.S. companies access the UK market is through the sales of their foreign affiliates, as I quoted earlier. So in terms of the numbers, I mentioned over $600 billion of sales are done by U.S. affiliates in the UK. That's compared to $140 billion worth of goods and service exports. In terms of the other way around, UK affiliates in the US produce $550 billion worth of sales, and $121 billion is the US imports of goods and services from the UK. So when thinking about international relations in terms of the current account and trade balances, this is really the way businesses reach their export markets, and in addition, the way that they provide jobs to the US economy.
And Saroj, how about Texas, UK statistics?
So going local, for Texas, so from a pure trade perspective, as we know, By far, much more important countries for Texas are, as you might imagine, Mexico, Canada, and China. So in that sense, the links with the UK are smaller. But just in terms of data, so this is from the census. In 2018, UK, in terms of recipient country for exports from Texas, was ranked 8th. It's worth around $8.4 billion. But what I want to point out is that the share was at 2.7 now, but it's been growing recently. It was only 1.7% in 2016. So it's becoming more important as an export destination. In terms of imports, it's 10th. So imports from the UK accounted for around $5.43 billion, and the share is around 1.8%. So overall, this is not like a big number, but still one could imagine that, especially on the export side, if there's a rapid deterioration of exports following actual Brexit, then that might hurt employment growth in the US, for instance. And there are two possible channels that we like to talk about as an economist. One is the price effect, the other is the income effect. So it's very likely that the British pound might depreciate, although it might really not depreciate. If there's an agreement, I guess it's too late tonight, but by tomorrow, if there is an agreement, I'm expecting the pound not to depreciate, but actually to appreciate. But regardless, I mean, it has depreciated quite a bit since the referendum. And
today. I couldn't resist. I mean, we flew out on the weekend. I'm afraid it was painful buying dollars. It was down at 1.2.
Right.
But today, on the news of the proposed Brexit, we're back up to 1.6. So it's moved in a very positive direction. I hope it continues.
Right. So it might continue. But in case of a depreciation, there's going to be much harder to export because the US dollar will be much stronger. So that's the relative price effect. The other is the income effect, in the sense that if Brexit is going to have a negative effect on the UK economy, then they're going to just consume less of goods and services, including that's produced in the US. So that's also going to hurt our export. So that could have some effect, although the numbers are not really big to suggest that there's really going to be any material effect in Texas. The other thing I want to point out is that sometimes in economics, like just thinking about direct linkages are not enough. Indirect linkages might play a role. So for instance, I could imagine that a Brexit that leads to lower exports from Germany, for instance, which is on the brink of a recession already, is going to be pushed into a recession. That's more likely. And then that could have some secondary effects. But purely from a trade standpoint, yeah, it's an important trade partner for Texas. But probably the numbers are too small really to have actually an effect on employment or wages in Texas, regardless.
Thank you. Michael, in your office's work with businesses, have you gotten a pulse from them on their concern about Brexit and trade with the UK or the EU?
Yeah, one of the important functions of our office is the export assistance. So through that export assistance efforts, we try to keep our finger on the pulse, or an ear on the word on the street on how businesses perceive Brexit. And there are some good news. To a large degree, businesses in Texas, especially the ones that we had directly connected with, see either no effect on their business, or right now are uncertain of what the effect may be, but in general are not very concerned. One thing that was slightly concerning to me is just how much misinformation there is. And so I'll bring up 2 points. Number one is the businesses are very concerned that their tariff barriers may go up post-Brexit. They think that there is a special relationship, that there is some kind of a relationship with the EU that they may not be able to enjoy with the UK. And to allay their concerns, there should not be any tariff barriers that will come into play, whether there is a hard Brexit or no deal Brexit or otherwise. Some concerns that are well-founded, or perhaps somewhat well-founded, are the non-tariff barriers. They are worried that some of the regulations, as I said earlier, both the UK and the EU are well within their rights to change their regulations, or how they look at technical requirements, agricultural checks. which from James's remarks, I'm fairly sure that it's not going to happen, at least not in the first few years. And another concerning trend that there is a misinformation about the intellectual property. About 1 in 5 companies that we talk to are worried about their intellectual property. And again, as James rightly pointed out, there should be no changes. It is a pan-European agreement that will not affect Texas business, especially those in the service sector.
So thank you. So as James mentioned, the UK is not permitted to negotiate trade deals with other countries while it remains a part of the EU, but there are certain things that are happening. And so our next question is, what are the prospects for a bilateral trade deal between the United States and the United Kingdom, and what might the timeline be? So I'll let James address that first, and then we'll go to Leah.
Wow, there's a loaded question there in some respects. And so there's some very good points. I mean, President Trump is not universally loved, but actually we have a very good intergovernmental relationship with your president and your federal government. And we're very fortunate that he's very proud of his Scottish ancestry. So, I mean, actually, genuinely, we're very fortunate that the United Kingdom and the United States do have a special relationship, however you choose to interpret that, in terms of its culture, its history, and the fact that so much business already takes place, and that both governments are very keen on doing something positive. And my understanding from a recent trade mission, I didn't mention this earlier, I mentioned it in part, I'm an elected representative for the City of London. I participate in trade missions to the United States and other parts of the world on behalf of London, and we know that whether you're a Democrat or Republican, we have quite good support across the political spectrum here for doing some form of deal. What that deal looks like and how far it is, I mean, I hope that we'll do it on what I call a bit of a salami tactic, in that we will probably choose sectors in order to do it a little bit quicker. One of the problems with a trade deal is if you're too ambitious on every single sector, it'll be 1 or 2 sectors that slow everything up. But of course, there's two to tango. The US will have a view on what they want to do, and I think the timing is the hardest part for me to respond to. But what I would say is this: it took us, as part of the European Union, 20 years to do a Mercosur agreement. I actually represented the Canadian government on the Canadian CETA agreement. It took us 7 years to do that. Now, a lot of that time wasn't the core elements of the agreement. It was the fact that within Europe, we had to get 28 countries to agree. And in the case of the Canadian agreement, a small area of Belgium called Wallonia stopped it at the very end. It almost sounded like a sort of a movie script. But the upside for us is that a bilateral agreement should be a lot easier to do. But I can't speak for the US side of that equation. But I'm quite optimistic because we have begun discussion, and I hope that therefore, if we have a new relationship with Europe by January, which is my expectation, then next year could be a year where we see a great deal of movement.
Mm-hmm. Leah, would you like to address that question also?
Yeah, so completely in agreement that the momentum is strong. I think there's unprecedented political will to move this forward because of everything that James mentioned. I think, again, it goes back to a slight dependency on the actual Brexit outcome, and that's really due to what is the playing field going to look like? What's the template going to look like when we start these negotiations? And we just don't know what that might look like as of yet. I think the interesting thing from a BABC perspective and our members, there was a working group that was established in the UK. They came over to the US. This has been 2 years, 3 years maybe, that they've been working on this. And they were very vocal about wanting to meet with companies and wanting to understand challenges that companies may or may not have with a potential Brexit. And that seems to have gone quiet. So I don't know if James has any more information on that or kind of where that stands, but we haven't seen anything, our members haven't seen anything from that. I think there's also been this discussion of America First that's come out, not to definitely, get into politics by any means, but the BABC thinks that it will actually be EU first, and that there will be obviously, a really strong partnership that'll be done and deal between the US, but the EU is the largest trading partner with the UK, and so we anticipate that will be a focus. Timeline, definitely would not want to say anything in regards to that.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I try and answer?
Yes.
I can't give a beautiful direct answer, and I forgive me for breaking the promise of the panel not to get a little bit political. But actually, in terms of the EU's view, one of the big issues that doesn't get widely reported is that the EU is very keen to keep the United Kingdom in close, tight regulatory alignment, precisely because that will interfere with our ability to do separate bilateral trade. And the shorthand that is genuinely used in the corridors of Brussels is they don't want Singapore on their doorstep. They genuinely fear a no-deal arrangement where the United Kingdom will immediately drop its corporation tax rate, and it will immediately make us a more regulatory-friendly environment to invest in. But that said, what is very, very clear is that the current Trade Secretary, the current Chancellor, our Finance Minister, and the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom have the US firmly in their sights. You are the world's largest economy by some considerable margin, and our ability to leverage our very strong existing relationships is one of the major upsides to our changed position. And so I know that certainly if the current government survives beyond Christmas, the absolute...
Which one are you talking about?
Well, I'm a traditionalist, so I'm going to say the Prime Minister of the day. But I mean, in all seriousness, some red lines on behalf of the UK government is not to agree to anything with the EU that would jeopardise our ability to try and do a trade deal with the US. I mean, that probably will be a major stumbling point, simply because that's one of the, I was going to say few upsides. I don't want to put it in those terms, but it's one of the upsides to our changed relationship with Europe is the independent trade policy. And if we don't have the ability to do that, then it was all for nothing.
So let me throw this question out that is not on the outline. So if it takes 7 years to negotiate a trade deal, what happens in the interim? What are the rules that apply in the default situation?
Well, we currently...
So let's say the Brexit occurs, the UK is no longer part of the EU.
Yeah.
There's no agreement. And so what does that world look like? What does the world look like until
Is your question
an agreement...
focused on the UK-EU as opposed to the UK with other third nations? Because we do have a slight variant.
I'm self-centered. I'm talking, what does it look like for the US?
For the US. Well, you see, the thing is that we don't actually have a trade agreement with the United States right now. So actually, tomorrow doesn't really make a difference. You know, what you do today and how you enter the United Kingdom won't really be any different. But once we are in a position whereby we are allowed to set our tariff barriers vis-a-vis the United States without consulting Brussels, then the United Kingdom will be looking to do things to encourage investment, because there will be an intake of breath over Brexit. It's not good for every business. There are people that are concerned. I mean, we're lucky. Half of US corporations, according to the UK government anyway, that have a headquarters overseas in Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa are in the United Kingdom. And we don't want that to change. And we don't want you to suddenly depart and do other things. Some may do so. But whatever we can do to ensure that that continues to be the approach of US corporations is the intention, because it would be somewhat suicidal not to take that approach. So because we don't have a trade agreement, you see the difference, to put it in context, is South Korea. South Korea has a trade agreement with the European Union. One of the reasons why it was one of the first and key countries for us to deal with is because of the close relationship we have in electronic goods and others. We needed to ensure that we could roll over the agreement so that we wouldn't have a jolt to our relationship with South Korea. And that's why the 44 agreements I mentioned, which apply to 70 countries. Obviously, there are more countries in the world, but it's a pretty big and positive start. And it's so that our economy does not have a jolt of a change of relationship with third countries that currently have an arrangement with the EU. But we don't have one with the US. So I see it as a win-win. Whatever we do with the US, it's going to be better than we do today.
So, Michael, although the negotiation of a trade agreement is the province of the federal government, what are the thoughts or concerns about in the governor's office at the state level about a trade agreement?
Sure. So just very quickly to follow James and the ad hoc question of what happens tomorrow. I'm from the government, and I love acronyms. So there actually is an answer, a very straightforward answer to it. James said it beautifully. I'll do it in government terms. It's called WTO MFN. There's an actual term for that. It's World Trade Organization's most favored nation rates. So we currently enjoy that it's a 164-member bloc that presets the tariff schedules and non-tariff as well as dispute resolutions. So and it's designed specifically for these kinds of instances where if the nations do not have a free trade agreement, I believe EU and UK as part of the EU has about 40. United States has significantly less than that. I think we have about 20 free trade agreements. So for everyone else, if they are a member of the WTO, which, as I said, 164 nations are, we go to most favored nation rates, which provides that kind of stability, and both for the UK and for the US. For the state of Texas, it is very much a great a good thing. UK, as much as we have a very strong relationship when it comes to investment, our trade relationship is somewhat less, as we pointed out, number 8, number 10, when it comes to trade. So it should not affect us that much. As for the question on the trade agreement, and please understand, I'm here as among many experts, and I'm definitely not a scholar, but I can speak on behalf of both the U.S. government, nor can I really speak on behalf of Governor Abbott, but I can speak as a person, as a practitioner in the trade. I completely agree that the free trade agreement is forthcoming. Leah mentioned that it might be EU first. I actually think that it might actually be US first. I think UK will do their absolute damnedest, especially if it's a no-deal Brexit, to conclude a free trade agreement with the UK. Again, in my opinion, there is actually some really good news, and the good news is, once again, another acronym, TTIP. So Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership that U.S. pulled out of, outlined quite a few, and both sides have agreed to quite a few points already. It's already there, and one of the reasons I think the renegotiation of NAFTA 2.0 or USMCA, whichever you call it, was in trade agreement terms very, very fast. In fact, for some it was lightning fast, is because of TPP and many of the points that were agreed upon there. So I think the free trade agreement is forthcoming. No, I don't know the dates. No, can I predict it? My economics my economics professor, Dr. Green, said that a good economist will give you a number and a date. A great economist will give you a number and a date, but he will never give it to you together. So
Leah, from the perspective of a U.S. business, what points would you want to see a trade deal address?
Yes, so coming from our members, some of the main things that they're looking at, which maybe we need to share with them some of the information that was on this panel about customs and kind of, tax and tariffs. I think that is a concern of theirs. So if there's anything that we can do to alleviate that, that's of interest. Migration of talent, again, already for those, mostly for those companies that have operations in the UK already, what will happen to their staff that they have if there is any kind of change in visa status, and then data going back to kind of GDPR and specific regulations that may come or may not come out of this in regards to information, who owns it, where it lives, that kind of thing. I think in general, the standards and beliefs are something, that there is harmony, as we've talked about, but do they need to be reharmonized? The thing that's always brought up is chicken. So in the U.S., the poultry industry, you cannot export chicken to the UK. You can't bring haggis into the United States. So are there opportunities around this potential negotiation that will either alleviate some of those specificities or provide more opportunity for companies to have kind of further chances to feed into that process and actually get more out of what potentially could be something that's really great between the UK and the US. So really, we're looking at those things right now from our member companies, but it really, again, goes back to being dependent on industry as well. And there are a slew of things that obviously in the life science and financial services sectors are very specific that they will want addressing or a conversation about.
Okay, thank you. So we have one more question for the panel, and then we'll get to the audience's questions. So what steps should a U.S. business or investor take to prepare for Brexit? And I think we have this question also planned for Leah, but the rest of the panel is invited to weigh in also. Would you like to start, Leah?
Sure. So, the things that we're working with our companies on is really just being prepared. Start now. It's complicated. It's potentially not complicated depending on, your the way that you think about it, but really educating yourself on the potential of what could or could not happen. There are a lot of resources that are available to help you do this. So the UK government has launched a new but old website about Brexit. Good resources, especially if you're smaller companies, and kind of some activities that you can do to be able to support that. And looking at other trade associations that are specifically industry focused, looking at the work that we're doing with the BABC, both in London and across the United States, and able to support these companies. I think, in order to prepare, it's really understanding your company, having the right people on the team to be able to assess your entire supply chain, assess where there may or may not be issues coming up, and making sure that you're compliant right now, so that whatever the outcome is, it's just kind of easing into anything that might be similar or different.
James, would you like to weigh in on this question?
Well, it's a hard one in the sense that it's going to be specific to the business and the industry area, because the regulatory arrangement for export of a pharmaceutical product is completely different to electronics regulation for your consumable. That said, I've got to kind of give you the positive end, and the two positive points I'd say is that right now and in the immediate, genuinely near-term future, there won't be any difference in what the UK expects for regulatory compliance for whatever you're exporting as a product to the continent of Europe that's the EU, because we're not changing anything overnight. And what we intend to change in the longer term is meant to make it better for US business. So I hope whatever we do change will be a positive. And other than that, I hope that you'll continue to look upon the UK as a great investment opportunity, and that hopefully our changing of relationships are about forging a closer bond, because we're allowed to forge a closer bond. And I hope that therefore, actually for most US businesses in the long term, you'll see it as a positive.
Right. Well, on that friendly note, let's start with questions. Go ahead.
One of the countries, if not the only one, that supports Brexit is the United States. And the current administration supports it as part of its effort to destroy the European Union. The Europeans understand this, and they see England as a bulwark of the United States against the European Union. If the British believe that that would not affect their commerce with Europe, they delude themselves. The other thing that they delude themselves is to think that the relations between the United States and England will reach such a height that they will benefit from that. They just need to see what happened recently to the courts.
Do you have a question? I think there's not a question.
Respond to that.
Would you like to, James?
Well, I mean, it's a comment on a much wider diplomatic situation. I mean, I don't think there's any parallel between us and the Kurds. I do think that you're right to say that some parts of Europe, but it's not a uniform view, would like to keep a wedge or keep a tension between the United Kingdom and the United States. But you see great divergence. The attitude of the French government is completely different to the attitude of the German government. The German government's been incredibly positive and friendly towards us in these negotiations. The French talk about the Anglo-Saxon economy to refer to the common law world in a very negative way persistently, and it's a cultural variation, it's a different perception on the economy. So it's absolutely true. But it goes also back to my point, which I shorthanded as they don't want Singapore on their doorstep. They don't want the United Kingdom being something that doesn't align with them, that sucks investment and trade away. But, you know, what the United Kingdom is looking to do is to return to where it once was. We are a relatively small island. We are fortunate to have quite a large economy, but we are a globally orientated island. Unlike many continental countries where their economy has always been about their domestic and their near neighbours, the United Kingdom's economy has always been global, from Australia to the United States. And as a result, we are looking to forge friendships with all those that are willing to have them.
Yes, ma'am.
So, if there is a no-deal Brexit, and so you just leave, are there rules in the EU that are constraints on what you can do next, or can you just start all these trade agreements that you're thinking about doing?
The end of your question is the easiest part to answer. We can do whatever we want if in those circumstances. But what I do want to puncture a balloon on is journalists love shorthand expressions like no-deal Brexit. There is no such thing as no-deal Brexit because there are a number of agreements that we are a participant in, that the EU is a participant in, that we will still be in whether we are in or out. And one of is the European Patent Convention Arrangement, for example, that EU member states are involved in that, and so are we. But also that we have a number of important bilaterals that which sort of sit upon the top. They will come back into force. And there's a lot of unilateral action. And I'll give you just one example. Back in March, when the European Union was genuinely concerned about us leaving without the withdrawal agreement, which is a divorce agreement. It's not a long-term agreement. In fact, it expires in December next year, regardless. And that's actually what all this is about. So it's not really about a long-term deal at all. But aviation industry. Most flagged carriers for the aviation industry are British within Europe, and we move more European citizens than any other flagged set of carriers. And they didn't want to disrupt that. So unilaterally, the EU passed a resolution that says that if we leave in what's called no-deal Brexit, then for a further, well, it was 18 months. By now it might be 12 months because I think it had an end date of next year. Planes will continue to fly. They will move European citizens around. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's assured mutual chaos if we do things like this. It's not good for us, and it's not good for them. And the EU is bankrupt without the UK's financial contribution. So for all these reasons, we might not have a perfect deal or a beautiful deal, and it might not be a deal that everyone loves, but there will be some form of a series of either bilaterals or an agreement this weekend.
As the negotiations have gone on, is there a feeling by the EU that they need to punish the UK for Brexit, or do you think rational thought will prevail over some period of time to come to what's in both parties' best interest?
I think both your observations are correct. But there's a big divergence amongst European countries as to why. The French would like to punish us. So it's an old arrangement. The German government has been much more practical, but I sat for 4 years on the supervising committee of what's called the High Representative to Europe. We've actually abandoned that role. I thought we dropped it too soon because we thought that the deal would be done by March, and so the High Representative to Europe finished at Christmas last year. But for 4 years we had a High Representative to Europe whose job was to shuttle diplomacy through all the capitals of Europe. And there are some Eastern European countries that have almost no trade activity with the United Kingdom, and they're kind of ambivalent. You've also got Scandinavian countries which have used the United Kingdom as a bulwark for a different point of view, for a different kind of direction of travel, and they don't particularly want to punish us. And so you have to kind of look across Europe. Portugal and Ireland have incredibly close relationships. Portugal's the one country that the United Kingdom was willing to bail out of the financial crisis because of the depth of our personal relationship, even though they're inside the Eurozone. So it rather depends on which country you're talking about. There's a strange tension between the pragmatism, which actually Angela Merkel's been very good about, saying, you know, they want to sell German cars. The United Kingdom buys more German cars than any other nation in Europe. It's a simplistic example, but it's not good for the German economy to punish us. But there are certainly others, and there are certainly many politicians at the diplomatic level, at the EU level, and bear in mind that the heads of state ultimately have to agree, but at the EU level that wanted to send the message, because some polls report that if Sweden had a referendum, if Holland had a referendum, or if Italy had a referendum, they would also vote to leave. So I think both your observations are correct, but I think that we've reached a stage of pragmatism that everyone knows it's not a great idea. We've been punished. We've had 3 years of self-flagellation and purgatory, and I'm hoping we can move on.
Okay, it's November 1st, and no deal, Brexit. You're all CEOs of an American company heavily invested in the UK. What are your plans?
Well, sorry to sort of puncture your scenario, but the thing is that the UK Prime Minister this coming weekend, if it is a no-deal scenario, is obliged to ask for an extension. And I can actually see no circumstances where the EU won't extend us to January 31. But if at some point we do go through that door, then I think that there's an immediate issue. But it's the issue that I think Leah was referring to. Whatever your business is, you have to be thinking now about what the consequences will be. For many businesses, they will be minor, but for some they will be devastating. But those that are facing that, and they're mainly in the tertiary financial services space, because actually a lot of financial institutions, a lot of banks, particularly if they're US headquartered, were principally operating out of London and didn't have a European operation, have in the last 3 years set those up and sought passport regulatory access so that they can continue their operations. But I think that most businesses, that Europe's a serious market, they've already thought that through.
Leah, Michael, Katie, would any of you like to?
Just to piggyback off of what James was saying about the financial services, I think they have done a lot of work preparing in advance. Ernst & Young has a tracker that shows out of the 91 financial services companies that they track in the UK, 41% have said that they would move operations or personnel to the continent of Europe or somewhere else. So I think businesses are planning in advance. And manufacturing, it might be a little bit more complex with the customs and the borders and checks at the border. But I think that businesses are starting to plan.
Yeah, and then our New York members, for example, they use this phrase that Brexit's already happened if they're in financial services, because they've already done all the planning. They've already set up, as James mentioned, like additional offices on the continent. So if I was in financial services, I'd definitely be watching, but I've done my homework and have already actioned it.
Yes, ma'am.
Since the U.S. has been looking for treatments in terms of American first, do you think that the UK is very in disadvantages after going out of the European Union in terms of assume zero negotiation in a treatment between the U.S. and the UK?
I may have misunderstood the middle of your comment, but I think if I've understood it overall, no, the United Kingdom is not disadvantaged, and the reason it's not disadvantaged is we're not allowed to do anything with the United States at the moment anyway. So we can't be at a disadvantage, but we can have that dialogue. How attractive are we to the US? Certainly an issue, because for many years we have gone around the world gleefully saying, come to Europe, but do it through us. And depending on the nature of your business, we can't offer that anymore, depending on the nature of the deal, which I can't yet tell you what that deal would be. But we haven't had the ability to have a genuine bilateral, full-scale trade discussion with another nation for 40 years. So it's a new opportunity for us to find different things. And in terms of what's referred to as American First, we're already alive to the fact that actually a trade deal with your current president requires obvious wins for the United States. But so long as we can find obvious wins for us as well, then it can work. And that, we think, is the focus. We think that the way to approach it is sectoral, and even sectoral within an industry. So within financial services, London is the largest, in fact, I think it's the only, clearing centre outside of China. We have more, we call them masala bonds, but more Indian trading bonds in London than anywhere else. We currently enjoy a lot of Eurobond clearing. The European Union says we can't do that afterwards, but actually they don't have the capacity to handle it when we leave, at least not immediately. Now, these things are not things that New York is active in, but New York is active in other areas. And so we would be trying to look at the opening of the regulatory arrangements in a manner that hopefully the US can see upsides and we can see upsides. I can't tell you what they'll be until that negotiation starts.
We've reached the end of our time this evening. I'm sorry for those who still have questions, but I invite you to come speak to the panelists afterward, if you might. It looks like we have one very disgruntled customer over here if we don't let him ask his question.
I was curious, the Scottish political parties have long since expressed opposition to Brexit, and they've even talked about a possible additional successionist vote. Do you think there's any possibility of problems within the UK itself if the Brexit deal is passed?
Oh, there's absolutely problems inside the United Kingdom, but it's one political party in Scotland. It's the Scottish National Party, and that's their whole raison d'etre, is to be an independent nation. And they declared this week that they want to have another independence vote next year. That's a much more complicated thing to get into as to whether that would or wouldn't happen and what the outcomes would be, but I would point out this, that actually although Scotland had a majority voting in favour of the EU, it was actually only 400,000 votes out of a population of 7 million. It's not quite as distinct as they might have you have. And equally the referendum vote was reasonably strong to remain part of the United Kingdom. And there are many, many Scots that hate the English. It's another old arrangement. And yet they wouldn't necessarily agree to cede from us because one of the things that they have to then take on board is their share of the national debt.
I want to thank our panelists and our keynote speaker tonight for coming to join us, and thank you for coming, and please feel free to ask your questions of the panelists. Thank you.
Great job. Thank you very much.
I love getting shot down by lawyers.